Hello, everybody. Elaine Mattingly here for the Stone City. See, I'm reading your screen already for the Grant Wood Country Forum. And can you believe we've been doing this 5 years, 5 times now, five years? So happy to have everybody here. So happy to be still collaborating with the Cedar Rapids Public Library. Um, and you can find these sessions on their YouTube channel. And we'd love to have you pop in and just keep all this witness what we've been doing these last 5 years and all the connections and everything that are being made. And today it's session 5 of 6 for this series with our featured presenter, Dorothy Bunting Montgomery. And we'll get with her in just a second. I want to be sure to mention just a couple things here. For those of you who are interested in writing some poetry for the upcoming Grant Wood Country Chronicle, you can email those anytime to the contact email that you receive. Just send those on over. If you have any questions, feel free to email me about that. And so we'd be happy to have your voice included. It's not a competition, by the way. What we do with that chronicle is for the purpose of having the voices of people who are immersed and motivated in all things Grant Wood have their voice be published. And the Cedar Rapids Public Library sponsors that publication. And we send a copy out to the participants who contribute, as well as to some select Grant Wood Country and related organizations and places, so that they have that with them as well. And so encourage you to do that. And speaking of all things poetry, next week we're going to have a Grant Wood Birthday Week celebration, and that's a 3-pronged stool for that. We're going to have Iowa's poet laureate Vince Gutierrez will be a featured presenter, and also reading some of his poems and talking about his role as judge for the Iowa Poetry Association's Grant Wood Poetry Award category, which he did last year and he's doing again this year. So that's really fun to have his perspective available to us, and his creative voice. Oh my goodness! So I think we hit the jackpot, as it were. We'll also be hearing again from Joe Coffey, who we know is an enthusiast extraordinaire, and he'll be talking about small treasures, the joy of collecting Grant Wood ephemera. I just love that word. So he'll be helping us figure out how to have a piece of Grant Wood, on a budget, perhaps just have a little something, or he could speak to, how collectors are seeing Grant Wood's things coming through the markets. So that'll be really fun to see. And then we have an addition to this, the last session next week, the voice of Ignacio Darnaud from West Hollywood, California, who is a enthusiastic follower of Grant Wood's artwork, research scholar, has published in some national journals about Grant Wood. And from his perspective of, he'll be speaking about the coded language that Grant Wood may have used, and I'll let him describe where he comes from on that. But as a closeted gay man, what we're seeing in some of the art that some of us might not recognize. So I'm really excited to have Ignacio and his voice sharing with us what he has uncovered and researched when it comes to the gay identity related to Grant Wood's artworks. So that's going to be really interesting. And I think, and he also has a piece of creative writing he's going to share with us related to that. So that's exciting. And anybody who wants to share their creative writing poetry that they've done throughout this session, you are more than welcome to do that at our celebration session next week. So don't be shy, just pile on. We'll just have some fun. And so more the merrier. And so with all those announcements under our belt and plus the fun news about fall plowing at the Figgy, we got all kinds of stuff happening here in Grantwood land, Grantwoodville, Grantwood country. I would love now to turn the reins over to our I don't know. I have a lot of wonderful adjectives for you, Dorothy, but uh, a uh, a heartfelt enthusiast. She's a historical fiction author. She's a professional speaker. She's been rolling around in Grantwood country for a long time as her homeland, as it is for some of us, but also doing it with the perspective of what it's like to live far away and then embrace Grantwood from that vantage point as well. So, Dorothy, if I would love, I've asked the presenters this session to feel free to give more perspective, a little more in your bio if you want to, anything about that. Don't be shy. We don't think it's bragging or anything. We just want to know stuff. That's what this group does. We just want to know things. So, Dorothy, would you please just do your thing?
Yes, thank you, Elaine. Elaine and I'll share something. Elaine and I actually grew up together. We grew up in the Anamosa area. We lived very close to Stone City. We were childhood friends, and later in life found that we loved Grant Wood, and that's how we came together to put these series together. And really, what's behind these series is we wanted people to know Grant Wood from the perspective of the locals, the people that lived in Jones County, lived in Lynn County, because we have a lot of that history, we have a lot of that perspective, and that became some of the fuel to bring these series to all of you. But we bring just different perspectives, whether it's through art, poetry, writing, and like Elaine said, we want you all to share in that. So as Elaine said, my name is Dorothy Montgomery. I'm living right now in the Los Angeles area. Just got through 24 days of fires, and thank you for everybody's prayers and support on that. But I want to talk tonight about a book that is written. It is not published yet. You can see by its title on the screen. It's called The Stone City Author. And as Elaine said, I tend to write about historical fiction. And the reason I love historical fiction because I love history. And I love that when you write in historical fiction, means you can talk about the past, you can use real life locations and dates and timings and people, but yet the story itself becomes creative and it allows the mind to really share perspectives and share stories from your lens. And so this is the second of a trilogy of books I'm writing about a heroine by the name of Patrice Powell. And my first book was called Stone Fruit. And I actually wrote it back in early 2000s. And when it was done, I'll share with you, I tried to get it published by an Iowa publisher, but the doors were shut. And here's why. They said Nan Wood Graham, Grant Wood's sister, as you all know, does not want any book published that is not true about her family and her brother. So with that said, I kind of put the book aside, and years later, we come into 2020. And once again, I just kind of opened this book, finish it up, and decide to self-publish it. That's what I did. So the first book is about a woman who is New York based. She works for an art magazine. She's asked to go back to her native Iowa to write about the death of Nan Wood Graham. And so the first book takes place in around 1990, 1991. And actually, Nan Wood Graham died on my birthday, which is December 14th, and she died in the year 1990. So I always kind of felt the kinship to Nan through a lot of my writing. And so that's where the story begins. So Patrice comes home to Iowa reluctantly. She's asked to write the story about Nan Wood Graham. She feels it's somewhat beneath her. She's focused on European art, which she is more impressed with. But as she comes home and she researches the story about Nan's life, she makes all these connections, especially to the historic Stone City Art Colony. And a lot of that book was my journey around this, which I'll share with you. And basically, my heroine discovers a unique piece of art that she reveals to the art world that is unknown. And that's the fictitious part. But the places, the people, the culture, the circumstances are all Iowa from the way that I know it. And of course, once she does this research and she makes these connections, she finds herself. And more or less, this book has a theme around acceptance. So as I wrote this book, I had a lot of people ask, would you write a sequel to it? Could you write a trilogy to it? And that's what I'm going to present tonight with my second book, The Stone City Author. But I want to tell you, too, how I kind of started writing this. I went to New York City for Christmas with my family one year. Never been to New York City at the time, never been there at Christmas time. If you know New York City at Christmas, it's beautifully decorated. Everybody's out shopping. And my spouse says to me, I want to go to the Metropolitan Museum. And I was like, really? It's Christmas in New York. Why would we go to a museum? Let's go shopping. But nevertheless, we went to the Metropolitan. And one of the very first exhibits I saw was of the regionalists. It was Thomas Hart Benton. It was John Stuart Curry. It was Edward Hopper from the Northeast and Grant Wood. And honestly, and I say this only to show my lack of knowledge, I said, gosh, that guy from my hometown, he did pretty good. Well, the laugh was on me. You know, a lot of us growing up, we just thought this was a local artist. And with the picture behind me of Stone City, a lot of us, and I've had people say this from Anamosa, when we saw how he made these round trees and these swollen hills, a lot of us kind of thought, well, that's nothing special. We could do that. Yeah, right. But really, this book was about my discovery of Grant Wood and just the wonderful pieces around the Stone City Art Colony. So a lot of my books take place in Stone City. You can see the Grant Wood painting behind me, Stone City, and I'm going to move out of the way a little bit. But this is my former school bus route. So every year heading to school, my brother too is on tonight. This was our school bus route. We go from, Biola through Stone City into Anamosa, where the larger public school was at. So I have this painting or this print actually in my living room. I know a lot of people in Jones County do. But this was just normal to us. We didn't think of this artist, Grant Wood, as anything big other than that local guy. So I'll start in with the next book. So the Stone City Author, my son has become a poet. So I got interested in poetry, and I can see now just some of the themes that are coming into this book. But I was always curious about, why do people like poetry? And I hope you don't take offense to that, Elaine, you especially, because you're my poet friend. But I just never really understood poetry enough to really be an enthusiast about it. But I will tell you, I learned so much about it writing this book. I'm going to kind of connect two kind of genres around creativity, around poetry, as well as artistry, around painting. But the Stone City Author, if you think about it, it could be two people. And the book is kind of playing with the reader to say, who could that Stone City author be? Because both Grant Wood, and if you know the other face, this is Paul Engel, a very famous Iowa poet, also one of the key people of the Iowa Writers Workshop. They both lived in Stone City, and they both worked out of the Green Mansion. So how I came across this story idea was actually, I have a muse, and he's my secret sauce, but his name is Tom Powell. And Tom Powell was an Anamosa newspaper editor. He was actually a neighbor to our family when they lived in Anamosa. And you can see that my heroine's last name is Powell. Well, this is for Tom Powell, because Tom Powell, if you ever have a chance to go through the Anamosa newspaper archives, he writes some great stories about Grant Wood. He writes some great stories about Paul Engel. And he was a storyteller himself. But two, my sister, who's in the audience tonight, Diane, she would come home and tell us these stories about Tom and his family because she knew Tom and his wife, Jerry, but she was also in the same class as their youngest daughter, Linda. And Linda is alive to this day. She's kind of my also secret sauce. She gives me a lot of backstory to a lot of the stories that I see in the Anamosa newspaper. She too has been following Grant Wood. She's been following the series, and she's just been a great support. So Tom Powell in my book is really the heroine's uncle, Uncle Gary, but it's all based on Tom, his stories, and stories that he shares with all of us through his newspaper out of Anamosa. So I'll start to share his connection now with these two. And I'll start with Paul Engel. So Paul Engel, as many of you know, grew up in Cedar Rapids. If you ever have a chance to read his autobiography, Unlucky American Childhood, and you want to know Cedar Rapids from the time periods of, say, 1910 through about 1930, this is the book to read. You get a sense that Cedar Rapids at that time hovered around Green Square. You know, there was the library, which is now the art museum. There was Washington High School, but all of life centered around Green Square. And Paul and his family didn't live far from there. Paul, as a child, was a newspaper boy, and one of his clients was Jay Sigmund, another famous Iowa poet. And I know we can definitely ping on Barbara Seller tonight. She knows a lot about Jay Sigmund. But Jay was one of Paul's clients, and Paul would often walk into Jay's house, deliver the paper, and say, I've got a new poem. Do you want to hear it? And of course, Jay would read it, gave them ideas and feedback. But that whole neighborhood became champions for Paul's future. So Paul goes to Washington High School. Who else went to Washington High School but Grant Wood, Marvin Cohn? Of course, they were about a decade ahead of Paul. But also Tom Powell went to school in Washington High School. So now you're starting to see connections. And that's what tonight is about. Is we know all these people, but do we know how they're connected? And that's what the Stone City author starts to do for the reader, especially the reader from Iowa. So Paul goes to school at Coe College. So does his friend Tom Powell. Both of their girlfriends lived in that area, went to school at Coe, and they're all double dating, so they're all very good friends. But then they start to separate. Tom moves on, graduates from Coe, and he goes and works at a paper in West Union, Iowa, and eventually buys a newspaper in Anamosa. Paul Engel goes on to school at the University of Iowa, where he gets one of his first masters in creative writing. That was very new at the time. He goes on to Columbia University and he wins a scholarship to Oxford, where he gets another MA in creative writing and becomes a very well-known poet. And in fact, he becomes a new voice in American poetry, basically taking his thesis of War and Earth, making it into a book, as well as has another book that he brings out called American Song. So people in New York are aware of this young poet, but he comes back to Iowa and he gets a job in the English department at the University of Iowa. Well, we're going to make some more connections of who else was at the University of Iowa during those years, but I'm going to continue on with Paul Engel. So Paul wasn't the founder of the Writers' Workshop, or what we now call the Iowa Writers' Workshop, but he definitely brought it to fame. His most influential years there were from 1945 to 1965. And if you read a lot of things about Paul now, there's a lot of criticism of him about his style and his approach. But what I feel that people miss is that he was the first one to really say, you love to write, you write creatively, I will help you make a living at it. And so he raised the bar high on these students, showing them what it took to get published by a New York publisher and how to earn and make a living doing what you loved. This was unheard of at the time. So as you all know, the Writers' Workshop is very renowned. In fact, when I talk about writing workshops here in the Los Angeles area, people always say right away, the best one is out of Iowa City, Iowa. It's like, yeah, it is. So Paul was so instrumental in this process and the step. And part of what he did is he helped different students earn fellowships so that they could come and they could write. So he was out there looking for talent, bringing them to Iowa City. And here's some of the very famous authors and professors that worked with and were tutelaged by Paul. You may not know all of these names, but if you look them up one by one, you too will be blown away by their accomplishments, by their connections. These are the writers, the poets that are all connected through the 1940s and 50s. It's quite a list. It's quite an impressive list. Well, not only is Paul recruiting great writers to the University of Iowa, but he's also making these connections in New York because he's well known at this point as a great poet. I could give you this huge laundry list of who all he's connected, but I'm going to hit some of the big names. One of the first one is Bennett Cerf, who was a writer, a publisher out of New York for Random House. He was one of the co-founders of Random House. Bennett was really well known for his candor, for his sense of humor. He was also on a show for 17 years called What's My Line, and he was one of the favorites. But definitely a key contact for Paul and his students in order to get published. Another person that Paul was connected to was Phyllis Fraser. She was actually originally from Kansas City, went to Hollywood, made movies. She made a movie with John Wayne that I've been able to find. It's a hard one to find. But she ends up leaving Hollywood to get a serious job and meets Bennett Cerf. And in fact, she marries him, and he makes her the head of a department called Beginner's Books, which is really the Random House divisions for children's books. We'll circle back to her soon. Another key connection that Paul had was with Henry Luce, the founder of Lifetime, Fortune, and Sports Illustrated magazines. This was a huge connection. Think about how much Paul could connect students to not only having books and poetry published, but also articles and magazines. Paul was also a literary critic. So Paul was this whole package. He was a critic, he was a writer, he was a producer. He was the full package of anything creative and artistically acumen and sound. So one of the things I'll share about Paul is Paul never forgot his roots. Paul would spend his summers in Stone City. The Green Mansion became his summer place. And him and his wife would spend their summers there. The very top floor of the mansion was his office. But he would often spend time with Tom Powell. Tom was either at the mansion in Stone City or Paul was often in Anamosa at Tom's house, sharing a lot of stories, a lot of opportunities. In fact, one of the stories Linda Powell shared with me is that Paul would come to their house. He would sling his leg over their couch and just talk to his dad for hours, but usually needing water or something that back out at the mansion, maybe the well water wasn't working or the electricity wasn't working. He was usually in Anamosa talking to his friend Tom, but sharing a lot of stories and sharing a lot of opportunities. So one of the opportunities that came was Paul heard about the European Union wanted to do some film on these very progressive towns back in the States. Well, Paul recommended Anamosa. And in fact, they made a movie of Anamosa in 1956, and you can find it on YouTube. It's called Small Town USA. And it depicts the day in the life of people living in Anamosa. You'll see the Powells there. You'll see a lot of people that you might know, especially if you come from Jones, Lynn County area. But there was a film. And at one point, you couldn't, before YouTube, the only place you could find that film was like in the Iowa State University Library. But he connected with this Harold Larson, who was a film producer. They came back to Anamosa. You know, Paul leverages his good friend, Tom Powell, and they get this film made. So Paul was always bringing a lot of opportunities, not only back to the University of Iowa, but to his friends in Anamosa and Stone City. One of the other stories I share in my book, and it's actually a true story, is the actor Robert Montgomery came and visited Paul and his wife at Green's Mansion here in Stone City. And what was really interesting about the visit is that, and if you know Robert Montgomery, an actor from back in the 40s and 50s, he was actually the father of Elizabeth Montgomery, who we know as the TV show Bewitched. But he came to see Paul. Paul was a friend. And Paul was like, so Robert, where are you heading to? And Robert said, I'm heading to Washington, D.C. I'm going to coach our new president, President Eisenhower. So the reason Robert Montgomery was coaching President Eisenhower is television was coming onto the scene. And Eisenhower was smart enough to know he had to develop somewhat of a a persona, a presence for this new audience that's on the TV medium. So that's just one of the interesting stories, but there's a lot of stories of people that came to this mansion, even beyond an art colony. There's a lot of history in this house, and I wish it was a house that was still standing. So as I was researching this book, thinking, okay, I've got an idea for a Stone City author, but I want to bring my heroine, Patrice, back from New York to Iowa to kind of solve a mystery. And I decided that her uncle was going to give her a call, and the uncle is going to say, hey, my good friend, Paul Engel, just passed away. And actually, Paul Engel did pass away in 1991. So I started my book at that time frame. So my books go back about 30 years ago. But the story begins where she comes back because the friend, the uncle who's been friends with Paul, says, Paul left me some clues. And he said they're clues to a literary treasure. And Patrice, I need your help to solve for these clues. So, how did I find these clues? Well, one of the things I was looking for, something very hard to find, is photos of the inside of Green's mansion. I don't know if any of you have come across photos of the inside of that mansion, but they're very hard to find. Well, I happened to find it through an article that Paul Engel did after he wrote the book American Child. And these are 100 sonnets that he wrote for his daughters. And in this picture is Paul, that's his wife Mary in the glasses, his older daughter, who's also named Mary, they called her Munchie, is on the phone, and then his youngest daughter, Sarah, is in these photos. But he wrote all these sonnets for his daughters and put them in a book. But he reached out to his friend in Life magazine and said, could I publish my sonnets? And they said, of course. So I have a copy of this Life magazine. And as I show you how I chose these clues for my book, I'm going to show you pictures of his daughter, Mary, in Stone City, and we get just a little bit of a glimpse of what's inside the mansion. So from his sonnets, I came across this piece called Wise in Water. I loved it. This is Mary at the Wapsie Pinnakin. She's got her feet in the Wapsie. And of course, he's writing sonnets about her life and watching her grow up, as well as Sarah. The next sonnet that I used as a clue in my book was a loved in secret language. I love this phrase. This is Mary looking out of the third story window of the mansion. And I'm told the second and third floors, even in the 1950s and 60s, did not have electricity. That's why it's very dark. But you see Mary looking eastern, and it must be kind of a nice sunny morning because you get this view and glimpse of her face in the sunlight. The third clue that I took from the sonnets was scraps from his own inventing. And of course, this is Mary constructing something. And the reason I love this one is this is a phrase I've seen from the 1930s, very much used back in the 1930s, which makes me think of Grant Wood. The scraps for his own inventing is about someone who through their hard work, they have made a great life for themselves. So in my book, Patrice comes back, talks to her uncle, and together they're trying to figure out how will these three clues get them to literary treasure. Another person in Life magazine from 1939 was Grant Wood. And I'll talk a little bit more about this, but at this point, Grant is being enticed to write his own autobiography. They're highlighting his program at the University of Iowa, where he's heading up the art area at the University of Iowa. So you're starting to see some parallels here, and that's what I'm having the reader understand. Okay, so back to the story. So I'm trying to entice the reader. Is the Stone City author, is it Paul Engel? It would make sense that it is. Or could it be somebody else? And I started to see these parallels of our two native sons, that both Paul and Grant Wood lived in Cedar Rapids. They both attended Washington High School and graduated from there. They participated in little gallery events. And this was, the little gallery was really this big house on First Avenue, not far from Coe College, 3 stories. And Edwin Rowan ran the little art gallery. And if you remember, he was also one of the co-founders of the Stone City Art Colony. But one day he had a show or an event. And imagine going into a house and going room to room and meeting very famous, what we consider now famous, Cedar Rapidians, I'll say it that way. Think about going in one room and you see Marvin Cohn demonstrating how to draw clouds. Maybe in the next room, you're with Grant Wood and he's taking you through his knowledge around mental work. Well, also at that same event was Paul Engel reading his poetry. So that's the first glimpse we have that these two men, their lives crossed. Once again, they're in this area. Cedar Rapids is a small city at the time. It makes sense that people who are creative and are artists are finding their ways of meeting one another. Both were professors at the University of Iowa. Their years together overlap from 1941 and 42. They both lived in the Green Mansion in Stone City, and they were both featured in Life magazine. So I found it interesting that these two were living very close lives and somewhat paralleling each other. And what this next slide is, this probably looks interesting, but this is a kind of blown up picture of the University of Iowa campus in 1942. That blue streak represents the Iowa River. Both these men, for about a year, were across the river from each other teaching. In the art building would have been Grant Wood. Across the river in Quonset huts was Paul Engel. Now, Paul was an English department professor, but soon he stepped into the writer's workshop, and there was a big surge of students coming post World War II that they had to put them in these little Quonset huts. And that's where Paul was teaching. So for one period of time, they were just right across the water from each other. But the one thing I also found in common were both were authors. So we start to introduce that in the story. So as Patrice and her uncle are working off these clues, they're thinking of Wise and Water, who would be someone who would also have a secret and loved language, and who is someone too that uses scraps for his own inventing. Well, they kind of decided to separate and interview a lot of people, but one of the people in my story in 1991 that they interviewed was Paul Engel's second wife at the time, Walleen. And in my story, I do use her name, and she basically confirms what the literary treasure is, but there is a twist. So at that time, she had just lost Paul, is what I write in the story. She wants his legacy to live on. But one of the things, too, is she's worried about is Grant Wood's legacy, because she feels like both men have just been kind of somewhat forgotten by the University of Iowa, maybe by their home state. And that is something that she puts on the heart of Patrice and her uncle to figure out. So as they're going back through these clues, which you see in front of them, the clues lead them to a thesis that's sitting in the University of Iowa Library. Remember, it's 1992, so we're going to act as if we don't know what this literary treasure is. And it takes them to Park Reinard. And I want to thank Paul Jewell tonight for giving me these photos. I've never seen these of Park. I love them. But as we all know, Park was a very good friend of Grant Wood's. He was a student at the University of Iowa. He was, too, one of the first people to get a degree in creative writing, and basically wrote his thesis on Grant Wood's life, especially his childhood. And this is where they find the fact that these clues lead to this literary treasure. And the pressure is on Patrice and her uncle to do something that Walleen feels that Park never did, was to publish this work, bring it out into the open. So I think a few of you are aware of Return from Bohemia, A Painter's Story. It was submitted as a thesis by Park Reinard in 1939. It is about Grant Wood's childhood in the Jones County area. And one of the things I want to say about this story is just kind of the essence I pulled out of it for the purpose of my book. But it's also, I'll step back, it's also interesting that Grant in 1935 had just painted Return to Bohemia. And this painting you can see is Grant Wood there in the painting. It's kind of a self-portrait of how he's looking at his work, and all the people and faces and figures around him are airing expressions about how people react to his work. One of the stories I always loved was Nan was always concerned about how people reacted to Grant's art, but Grant would always say, I just care that they do. I don't care if it's good or bad. I just care that they get something from it. And whatever that meaning is, that's important to me. Well, if you look toward the back of this painting, it's hard to see, but there's a barn back there. I'm going to start to make a connection to this painting and to the story Return. I'll go right to it. Actually, I'll go back to it. Return from Bohemia. And I'm going to read a part from it. And this is one of my favorite parts of this story that I think often gets missed when people talk about it. And actually, I think I'm going to move ahead here a little bit. We're going to focus on a concept called the meadow. And I'm going to read this part of the story to you. I want you to focus on what this meadow means to Grant Wood because I weaved it into my storyline. But the thesis reads, and we believe these are Grant's words, but it's our Park that actually wrote them. Father had finished the top of the bench and was notching one of the solid ends when I noticed a glow of sunlight creeping into the dusty corner of the barn. I looked up and saw Mother standing in the doorway, the intense sunshine glancing from the white surface of her apron. She had a tall glass of milk in one hand and some molasses cookies in the other. Well, don't sit there like a Stoughton bottle, she said to me, laughing. I bought you some cookies. Father looked up from his work. I didn't see you there, Hattie. I came to see how my bench is coming. Here's a glass of buttermilk for you, Marble. While Father drank the buttermilk and I munched the cookies, Mother admired her bench. It seems too good to push wash tubs on this, she said, feeling its smooth surface. She sat down beside me on the old apple barrel and we watched Father work. Her apron smelled clean and crinkly as a cool morning smelled in early summer. It was pleasant sitting there in the big, dark barn with her beside me, and no sound except the singing of Father's playing and the smart rap of his hammer. If Father seemed stern and remote to me, Mother, by contrast, was very human and close. Not that she was volatile. On the contrary, she was almost as reserved as Father, but her restraint was earth-born. It was penetrable, understandable, and one felt her warm humanness all the more because it was subdued. Mother was small and willowy, and people often remarked that she seemed too delicate for farm work. Mother was sensitive on this point and quick to refute it by her actions. She did not like to have others wait upon her and kept her household going with a steady, indomitable efficiency. Her body was slender, wired, tempered far beyond its logical strength by her will, as she had the Yankee knack of getting things done. In the musty half light of the barn, I watched her face intent on Father's actions. From her expression, one might guess that he could do nothing wrong that was not perfect in her eyes. Her face had some of the cherubic roundness characteristics of her father's family, the Weavers, although it was much more thoughtful and dignifying than mine would be. Her nose was small and slightly upturned, a suggestion of the Puritan there. Her firm chin indicated Dutch stubbornness underlying her gentle ways. At base, hers was the practical nature of the New Englander, contrasting with Father's Southern deliberateness. One of the first flowers I learned to recognize was Sweet William, and it always seemed to me that Mother's eyes were that same prairie sky blue. They had a faraway remembering light in them, not sad, not like the unfathomable loneliness that haunted Father, but merry and practical. Her voice was small and well modulated and rang with a faintly abstract twang bearing the slightest suggestion of prophecy. Some nights she read to me before I went to sleep, usually a moral tale published in the Sunday school paper. When I was too sleepy to follow the story, which was always the same anyway, I loved to hear the unstrained cadence of her voice easing me into spacious, leafy sleep. How natural, how inevitable it seemed that we three should be together in this generous twilight of the great barn. In retrospect, the scene remains as simple and clear as the impression of a rain that fell this morning. I can still smell the fragrance of the pine shavings, hear the whistling of my father's plane, feel the presence of my mother at my side. It was as if we three had been drawn together in that place and moment to create an image for remembrance in place and time. These early years were composed of many such images. The world we lived in was like a green meadow against which things and people and events stood out with startling clearness. All took place upon that meadow in an ordered flow, attuned in some mystic way to the great central rhythm which determines the growth of crops and the coming and going of the seasons. I accepted our little world as complete, self-explained. I did not ask how it came to be or what ground laid outside. Today I look back and wonder, what were the paths my parents traveled and their people before them, the paths that led to my meadow? What strange convergences of destinies brought together my father and mother, those two so different in background and personalities. The paths fade quickly with the years, yet segments of them may still be seen stretching back over the hills of the past. There they are, clear for a way, now obscured by foliage, now clear again. They drop below hillsides, emerge like gray tapes from far valleys, and finally lose themselves forever in the distance. Like all paths of human life, they varied with countless factors of race and time and place, but always one force was dominant in fixing their direction, and that was the power of the soil. So as Patrice and her uncle find this literary treasure, the question becomes, should they publish it? And that becomes this moral dilemma of the story. And one of the things around the moral dilemma is you got to remember that my heroine, Patrice, is a journalist by trade. And in her mind, it's important to share with the public the things that you find to make sure that everybody has the public knowledge and education. But what she finds through the rest of the story is this question, once again, should it be published? You have Walleen Ingle saying, we need to publish it. Why didn't Park Reinard publish this? It was his thesis, even though we believe Grant narrated it. But it was something too in my story that I depicted that Nan also wanted Park to do, is publish this autobiography. And at the time, back in the late 30s, early 40s, Grant was being reached out to write his book. He had an opportunity to write his autobiography, so he's hoping to use both his thesis toward completing an autobiography, but it never came to be. So when Patrice, and she continues this journey, finds out that Grant has an inner circle. And if you read back through the Anamosa newspaper archives, you can find the names of his inner circles, but it would be people like John and Isabel Plume, is Park Reinard. They were very protective of Grant and his legacy. And so I introduced this inner circle into the story. And one of the things that I have my heroine do is have a conversation with Park. She finds out that Park is coming back to the Grant Wood days in Anamosa. At this point, it's 1991. Grant has passed away since 1942. And she's on that journalism surge to say, I'm going to get this published, and I want to understand from his inner circle why I'm starting to get some pushback on it. And of course, the inner circle, which she has come to know, is saying, talk to Park about it. So I'm going to read the next excerpt from my book, The Conversation That She Has with Park. And once again, this part is fictitious, but basically her and her uncle go to Iowa City where they meet up with Park. And this is the conversation they have around this moral dilemma. So the place that they're at a coffee shop and in Iowa City, and they've got their coffee in hand. They're basically walking to a room to talk about this piece. And they walked toward a portion wall and found their way to the other side. They entered a make-to conference room with a table and chairs for 8. There was a large window on the far wall of the room. Park sat at the table, and Patrice and her uncle sat down opposite him. He said, to answer your questions, I have no plans to publish it. This is Park saying, I'm not publishing this. And they said, we hope you'll reconsider, because they know that the thesis is his property and they've got to get his permission to publish it. And Patrice once again says, I hope you will reconsider. She glances at her uncle, whose eyes are fixed on Park's face. It would be a great tragedy if Grant's autobiography and story isn't told. So Park asked the question, are you wanting this work published so you can write about it? That's what he poses to Patrice. She's a little surprised by that comment, but she's honest and says, I am. And so he asks her, what are the stakes? And she said, I'm not sure I know what you mean. No one said a word. To alleviate the silence, Patrice continued, you have in your possession, Park, the autobiography of Grant Wood. And for the first time that we're aware of, he puts his life in the written word versus on a canvas. The quiet painter spoke. Patrice paused. Publishing this is giving Grant the final say in his life. And you can shape that. So when you ask me if I plan to write about it, the answer is yes. After I've heard everything he endured through his critics, the University of Iowa, and how they've written him out of the art history books, I want to change that, and I'm hoping you do too. I'm going to pause for my story and talk about what happened at the University of Iowa. Many of you know that when Grant was a professor at the University of Iowa, at the time they made him the professor, they had an art department that was very outdated. And they wanted Grant to come in and heighten the bar on that art department, which he did. And he used a lot of the practices that he used at the Stone City Art Colony by taking students out into the local areas, the rural areas, to paint things that were real, things that were surrounding them, things that were natural and honest. He did not have them in the classroom. Well, lo and behold, as he has his tenure there, there's a new chairman that comes to the University of Iowa. His name is Lester Longman. And Lester Longman came about 1936. He was an art historian, and he was Princeton educated. And he came to elevate the art department by making it very progressive. And he had this progressive art education model. Basically, Lester Longman wanted to bring textbooks into the classroom. He did not like Grant's style. He didn't like that Grant didn't have them in the classroom. He had them out surrounding, the local communities. And both of them clashed. They clashed over just their different values, their different perspectives on how art should be taught. There was some jealousy there because, as you saw, Grant's program was in Life magazine. Grant was getting a lot of attention. And Lester was basically, how it's written, very jealous of that. And it's Joni Kinsey, and I'm going to go back a few slides, that actually has this on YouTube, but it's called Grant Wood's 125th birthday. And she talks about this feud, and it's fascinating. And as we know, Lester Longman really wins the battle. He also writes for an art journal. He defames Grant Wood in many ways, through meetings, through writings, everything, to the point that, Grant's demise is coming forth. And Grant gets sick, of course, with pancreatic cancer, and of course loses his life. But part of that, honestly, I think is a lot of the stress that he endured from just that tenure at the University of Iowa. Once again, different perspectives of art. But the sad part is that when we lost Grant Wood, we really lost a very well-known and cherished Native son. And the one thing that Joni Kinsey said that I thought was spot on is the University of Iowa took a long time to honor Grant Wood. And in fact, they realized in the last decades that they have never had a painting of Grant Wood's at the University of Iowa. And the story goes that when they realized that, they reached out to the Joslin Art Museum in Omaha, asking to buy Stone City. And what I loved about what the Joslin Museum said, their response to the University of Iowa was to say, we bought that back when he was a nobody. We knew great art then, like kind of saying to the University of Iowa, but you didn't. And today, of course, we know that the University of Iowa has plaid sweater, but it took the university a long time to really show honor to Grant Wood. And I will step back what happened there. So Lester Longman, he was connected very well to universities at the North in the Northeast. He was wanting to heighten the reputation in the art department at the University of Iowa. So he wanted to bring textbooks into the curriculum, and he did. But he was so influential with those creating the art history textbooks that he and his colleagues wrote Grant Wood out of the art book. So it wasn't until the 1980s, and this is what was shared by Joni Kinsey, the professor of art at the University of Iowa, that pretty soon in the 1980s, students started to say, why is the painter who painted the most iconic painting in the world, one of the top three, American Gothic, not in our art history books? So there was this resurgence of interest in Grant Wood after the university and Lester Longman kind of tried to keep his shadow out of the art history books. And one of the things, and that's why I brought this into my book, this is that moral dilemma, was about how do we preserve Grant Wood's legacy. So one of the things I'm going to give a shout out to is my home area for having the Grant Wood Days. They started up in 1973. And when I think about this, if you align to Joni's rendition of having Grant Wood written out of the art history books, thank goodness that places in Iowa kept his legacy alive. He wasn't forgotten by his hometown, his home counties. I realize now how important those events were to keeping his legacy alive. So back to the story. So when Patrice is sitting in a coffee shop in Iowa City saying, we should publish this autobiography, you have Grant Wood's circle of friends saying, should we? You know, he's already been beat up. He's always been criticized. He's almost been defamed. Why should we print this autobiography? So I'm going to go back to my book and how I kind of finished that scene. So basically, Patrice said, publishing this is giving Grant the final say on his life. And you can shape that if you publish this autobiography about his childhood, is what she's saying. And Patrice said, after I learned everything that happened by the critics, the University of Iowa, and how they've written him out of the art history books, I want to change that. And I want to do that by, publishing or asking for the rights from Park to publish that autobiography. And she said, we can bring his legacy back. But Park doesn't see it that way. Park says, she's saying, do you understand what I'm saying? He said, I do, but I don't like what you're suggesting. The art critics aren't content to let these things die, is what Park says. And her uncle broke in with a calmer voice. So Park, basically, how would you do it? If you were us, how would you do it? And Park replies, somewhat like Paul Engel did. He didn't bring it out in the open. He left it for people to find and discover. So one of the things, too, that Paul Engel did was he was actually in the English department when the thesis was written by Park Reinert. And that's why tonight is about connections. You're seeing how all these people were working together and connected. And Park is saying, we're just going to leave the thesis in its place and we're going to leave it for people to find. And so Gary Powell, Patrice's uncle, said, let's step back. Why did Grant want his story told? And Park said Grant was under contract with the publisher to tell a story, but he didn't live long enough to finish it. And Patrice said, well, since his death, his sister Nan has given you, Park, permission to publish it. There are many expectations for you to finish it. What are your intentions for this piece? Patrice waited with bated breath at the answer that she would get from Park. And Park said, the family did give me their permission because I hold the rights to this thesis, not the University of Iowa and not Nan. I've asked myself, what would have happened if we finished the book and had published it before Grant's death? What if I would have published it as is after his passing? Remember, I'm very deliberate in everything I do. I wouldn't have had the career that I've had if it wasn't for the calculated ways of thinking. And that's because Park Reinert in real life went on to work for governors, he worked for congressmen, and ended his life in the Washington, D.C. area with that type of work. So he said, so you've asked me why I didn't publish it, but the question that should have been asked is if I should have published it. What do you mean, uncle and niece say at the same time? At every stage in our lives, we make decisions that will profoundly influence our life and the lives of others. My mother taught me that. When Grant passed away, there was no more autobiography because he was the story. Park pauses and reflected. Did you notice where the autobiography ends? And Gary, the uncle, said, yes, when Grant's father died and the family leave Anamosa and they moved to Cedar Rapids. And Park said, precisely, the story never left Jones County. And I made the decision that's where it started and that's where it ends. Patrice stood up and she walked over to the window and thought. Park's eyes followed Patrice as he continued. To your point about publishing it, as I wrote the thesis with Grant's help and with his voice in my head, every painting he ever painted started to appear in my mind. Every moment he spoke about, from his mother's reciting of the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere to him as a little boy, or appraisal, as he noted how his neighbors talked about outsiders, to the soil which drew people to that area, which also killed their spirit. What he didn't want to lose was, and Patrice says, the path to his meadow. Patrice looked at the two men who had questioning looks on their faces. The meadow he wrote about is home. Patrice walked back to the table and sat down with her hands cupped in front of her. Many of his paintings, you could say, were Grant wanting to go back home to a time when his mother and father were both in his life, a time of love and safety, and a person feels, and that feeling a person feels when they're in the presence of their parents. Like you said, his soul is in his paintings. And Park says, so you've read it. Now that you have, let me pose the next question. By not publishing it, by not writing about it or exposing this autobiography to the world, what is gained? And the uncle said, it becomes something that next generations find. And Park says, and what happens when they find it? They'll read it and they'll become curious about Grant Wood. And because they had to work so hard to find it, the piece will be treated like a valued treasure. And Patrice says, a treasure that lasts through time, a way to preserve the path to his meadow. Is this what the circle of friends of Grant Woods is trying to say to me? Is this what this is about, to preserve what's important to Grant and his legacy? With that statement, Park smiled, stood up, and leaned on the table. Nan had her ways, and I have mine. Don't forget, I was a publicist too. Patrice said, one day I hope you'll consider my uncle and me part of the circle. And Park says, matter-of-factly, you know the entry fee. We do, Gary Powell said, looking at his niece. It's code for we better not publish or write about this autobiography. And Park said, I have to get ready to head to the airport. I'm taking a later flight to DC today. And they stand up and they thank Park. And Patrice, still deep in thought, ends the scene by saying, Park, when you said the story began in Jones County and should end there, what did you do with your copy of the thesis? And Park says, you mean the original? They say yes. And I end the scene by writing, it went back into that rich Iowa soil with Grant. So my story about the Stone City author is about literary treasure, which becomes the autobiography of Grant Wood. But it becomes about the moral dilemma of how much should you share, especially after someone has been battered and bruised by the critics, by their employer, by their home state. And what do you do with that? And the point of the story is to say, sometimes you let the legacy lie and you let future generations find it. Because how I feel about Grant Wood and how I feel about Paul Engel is their talents were so incredible that no one, no university, not the critics, can ever keep that talent at bay. They are so incredibly good at what they do that time and legacy will bring out their greatness over and over again. And that's what these two men have done. So before I end there, I have one last piece to share with you. So one of the things we don't talk about very often is who owned Green's Mansion and who owned this property. Well, back at the start, when it was first built, it was owned by a quarry magnate by the name of John A. Green. That's why we call it Green Mansion. We don't call it Green's Mansion, but Green Mansion. And this mansion actually burned down November 11th, 1963. And a fire started in the house. And one of the things I really cherish about that story was that the locals knew that Paul lived there. They knew Paul Engel's papers were on the third floor, and they dashed into that house and they grabbed Paul's papers before they were lost. And when I was growing up, all that was left of this mansion was just the foundation, the front steps, and a few outlines of those Italian fireplaces. And we used to play there. And so this also sparked a lot of my love and creativity for this location. But who owned it after John A. Green was the Nissen family. Well, this is Paul Engel's connection to the Nissen family, which, of course, as we know, the mansion was also the home of the Stone City Art Colony. These are scenes from the 1930s, the summers of 32 and 33, when Grant and his colleagues started those artists into a lot of art classes throughout those summers. But once again, and if you remember in what I presented a year ago, I talked about the notable students at the Stone City Art Colony, but I forgot one name, and that name was Mary Nissen. So Mary Nissen's father and mother, they bought that location. They bought the mansion, they bought the land. And Mary Nissen grew up in Cedar Rapids, went to school in Washington High School. She graduated. She was dating a gentleman by the name of Paul Engel. She married Paul when he was at Oxford getting his second master's in art. Now, what's interesting is Mary, after graduating from high school, goes to school in New York City to become a graphic artist. And so she can design book covers. In fact, she designed some of Paul Engel's book covers. But she not only did her parents rent this land to Grant Wood and his faculty, but she also attended the Stone City Art Colony throughout her summers in college. Well, then she marries Paul Engel, and this is Mary. And one of the things that happened is before she married Paul, though, when she's in college, she's in New York City, and there was a local art show in 1935 put on by Grant Wood. So she goes to that show because she knows Grant. She's been to the art colony. Her parents rented the property to him. And what you can find online is who all attended Grant's show in Manhattan. And you see wonderful names like Eleanor Roosevelt. Well, you see the name too of not only Mary Nissen, but also a very famous graphic designer by the name of Ted Geisel. Ted Geisel becomes Dr. Seuss. So Ted was a graphic designer. He's at Grant's show. So is Mary Nissen. They're both, like I said, can do all kinds of art. But Ted Geisel becomes one of the co-founders of Beginner's Books with Random House. So if I take you back to Bennett Cerf and his wife, Phyllis Fraser, Phyllis and Ted Geisel started the children's department of Random House. And I weave their story into my story as well. So I'll leave that up to you when I get this book out there and get it published. But one of the things that I'm trying to tell throughout all of my stories is really all these connections to Stone City, all these connections of our famous native sons, and they were right in our backyards.
All right. Thank you so much, Dorothy. Connections Palooza. Told you so, told you so. Well, does anybody have any questions or comments or things to share? Joe.
I have several, but I'm going to start with a silly one and then wait and let everyone else have a turn. Mary Nissen any relation to the inventor of the trampoline? George,
Yes,
did I say
sister.
that and I missed it? I'm sorry.
No, I was going to bring that up, so I'm so glad you did. Yeah, George Nissen was a brother, a younger brother to Mary. And what I love about George Nissen is Joe said he was the inventor of the trampoline. And any of you who have ever been to the Jones County Fair, especially back when I was growing up, at the very entrance of the Jones County Fair in Monticello were trampolines off to the left, and people were playing that game where you jump up, you have like what looks like a volleyball in your hand, and you jump high and you push it through a chute to the person on the other side of the trampoline. They capture the ball and push it back to you. Well, George invented that game as well. So here, all of this stuff, all these connections were around us, and we had no idea. No idea.
Do we know, remind me, what happened to the Green Mansion site after the Nissen family? Do we know?
You know, I don't know who, and maybe Teresa knows, but
Yeah, I saw she was on. Yeah.
yeah, Teresa, do you know who might have owned that land and property after the Nissens? Oh, you're on mute. Or she's trying to get off mute.
Whoops. Whoops. Can't quite hear you yet.
Okay,
There you
I
go.
think they owned it when it burned.
Okay.
Paul was living there when it burned, but it was still owned by the Nissens, I think. And so I don't think anybody owned it after the Nissens. He just lived there. You know, he was still. I don't know that he rented it from them, but it was still their property. And remember the big barn?
Yeah.
They had all their trampolines in the barn.
That's right.
Ah.
Because that was like into the 80s or something, wasn't it, Teresa?
Oh, maybe even later. Yeah. That big barn that is now somebody lives in. The trampolines were all in there. So Nissens owned the whole property, I think, for a long time.
So Teresa, do you want to share your background to Stone City for those on our session tonight that don't know your legacy to all of this?
It's sure been fun listening to this. My great grandfather was one of the 3 quarry guys from Stone City. So in this last book, the Dearborn quarries is mentioned, which is really nice of you to mention them. But it was the Green and the Dearborn and the Ronan quarries, and now it's just Weber quarries, and the other quarries aren't even really running anymore. But yeah. That barn you see behind Dorothy and the general store there behind Dorothy were started by the Dearborns, and the blacksmith shop. And
did I go the wrong way? I did.
Yeah, and it's weird because it was kind of like a family co-op, you know, like mom's. And that church over on the right or on the left there, my sister always says that was the scene of the crime. That's where mom and dad got married. And and as all of my mom's siblings get married in that house. So yeah, Stone City was definitely where we hung out when we were young.
Well, it was Teresa that sent me the article about the fire and about the community going in and saving Paul's papers. And like I said, my sister Diane that's on the call tonight, she remembers the Powells and all their connections to the Ingalls and hanging out together. And it's just funny how we grew up with all these stories, and that's what's been fun about writing about it, is trying to weave it in. I think one of the hardest things tonight was just trying to weave in all these connections. But, you know, I write these books so people have the history and the education of what's in their own backyard. You know, what Paul Ingle did for the Writers' Workshop is phenomenal.
It's phenomenal. And you go to Iowa City, and it's obvious now, which in your book, it through the book, they're still not recognized to the point that they should be.
They're not.
But it's great that they are now.
Yes, and that was one of the things that was hard on my heart. And you even see I didn't quite go there tonight, but yeah, it was felt that the university just did not honor these two natives. And a lot of it was a lot of the people at the university just couldn't believe, I'm just saying it from my perspective, that such great talent could come from the farmlands of Iowa.
Right.
And absolutely it could. There's a lot of talented artists and writers and poets in the state. But there's always that feel like, no, you're not as sophisticated as the Northeast or wherever. And that's one of the points I wanted to make in my book, that there was such greatness. So I'm just blown away by what came out of Cedar Rapids and Jones County. In fact, I wish almost that our high school, Anamosa, had like a feeder mill to the Iowa Writers Workshop. That would be a legacy I'd like to go back and do and say, we should help those young writers from Jones County, Lynn County, get into the Writers Workshop and develop those talents. It's a miss because it's right in our backyard, and it's a miss.
Yeah.
And Dorothy, a great job tonight, I might say.
It was great.
Read it. And I've read your initial novel, and it was so good. I would mention that you and I have talked about this, but there's another great story of two men that escaped from the penitentiary in Anamosa and held the whole family hostage. Maybe somebody knows some of those details. It's a good story, and no one was hurt. But I think Mary and the two daughters, or the mother and two daughters, were there. I don't know all the particulars of that.
So Teresa, maybe you know that story. I was thinking you had sent me that article, but yeah, two convicts escaped and held up Paul and his wife Mary and their family, kind of held them hostage, and somehow they kind of befriend the convicts enough to kind of slip away from them or something. But
I could have sent it to you because I sent you a lot of stuff, but I'm not sure. I don't remember that one so much.
Yeah.
I remember a couple of worse ones, but that didn't end up as nice as that. But
what I love about those stories are those are the things growing up in Jones County we worried about, right? The penitentiary for one of our two largest state penitentiaries sits in Anamosa. When they would escape, they'd follow the railroad tracks. They would go through Stone City and Viola. And those of us living in those areas were always a little concerned about escaped convicts. So I love the stories just because those were some of the essence and the feelings that we grew up with. And even tonight, as I mentioned about how we kind of just looked at Grant as somebody from the local area, those were attitudes. I had someone after reading my first book said, I'm so glad you said that we struggled with his greatness, because we did. We just thought this was some guy who liked to paint in the neighborhood.
Well, my dad and my aunt, who was from Stone City, they were of the war generation. And so he was somebody that was painting while they were running off to war. And my aunt that lived at Stone City in that house thought they were just like a bunch of hippies up there.
Yes.
That they were just misbehaving up there. So there definitely was an attitude.
There was an attitude. My dad had the same attitude, kind of thought Grant was a bum because he knew he didn't pay his bills. He wasn't hardworking. This is Depression era, so put Depression era over this. But when I started to write the very first book, I went to a writing class at the University of Colorado. I actually lived in Boulder area for a while. And I remember I kind of brought this book forward, and my professor walked out with me that night. And she said, how did you come up with this story around an art colony in Depression around cornfields? And I said, well, it's a true story. But I said, it took me to hear stories like The Bridges of Madison County or Field of Dreams, which is Sheila showed Jackson Returns to Iowa. It was those Iowa stories that gave me the confidence to write about this. But she said, honestly, I love the content of this book. She goes, more than those other stories. The reason she did is you just don't put an art colony in the Depression era in the middle of cornfields. That was just unheard of from people outside of our state. But I love those perspectives. It's like they just don't think of artists in the cornfields. It's like, oh yeah, there's a ton of them. Yeah. And they're very good at what they do, kind of thing.
Well,
I thought you did great.
I think you bring your talk just brings up so many interesting dynamics, and before I forget, I think it's way fun and interesting that this forum is meeting at the same time that there's finally going to be a catalog raisonné for Grant Wood. I mean, I'm just tickled pink that we're converging timeline wise, because obviously it's been a very long time. And and not that every artist gets this, but so that renewed level of respect, we're witnessing it, there's been some things. And I will say, and I think it's interesting with Grant Wood's essay about revolt against the city and that sort of thing, that it's very, very real that there's a lot of people in rural areas who consider art either a luxury or not important. And, I mean, you can play your fiddle or something, for a
Yeah.
pastime, but I mean, that's there. But I
Mhm.
do think also, in rural, and there's a lot of rural areas that people actually are creative in their own way. And there's hidden
Yeah.
gems everywhere, you know.
Well, when
I
you think
guess
about just growing up in Anamosa, we had the paint and palette. I mean, Elaine, it was all around us, and Teresa and my brother
Yeah.
Daryl's on the call too. It was, I mean, my aunt painted. My aunt remembers the artists from the Stone City Art Colony up and down the streets of Anamosa painting in the countryside. I mean, it was all around us. But you're right, there was kind of this work ethic that said, if you're anything in your weight of gold, you're not going to do that. You're going to work, and so yeah,
or
For sure.
right. Or, I
Yeah.
mean, your point that it was a missed opportunity possibly to be a feeder. I think that feels like it was something that would just never be thought of.
Mhm. Yeah, because I actually was going to go to college for writing, but I didn't even know about their Iowa Writers Workshop. And I was in the creative writing class in Iowa in our high school. You would have thought they would have said, hey, or the guidance counselor, hey, there's the Writers Workshop down there. You might want to think about it, but no one ever brought that up. And I didn't know about it. And I just used that as an example of, we've got all this talent and all these opportunities, but sometimes, we don't make it known to everybody. One of the last stories I want to share too about Paul Engel. Paul Engel, we know, was well connected, but he also knew Meredith Willson, and you all know from the movie. All of a sudden, I can't think of the movie. What's the name of the movie?
Music Man.
Music Man.
The Music Man. Thank you. Well, Meredith Willson wrote all the music to that score of that movie, but he also wrote the University of Iowa fight song.
Oh,
And the year that Meredith Willson came to the University of Iowa, he was the halftime show there. He kind of led the band in, the Iowa fight song. Well, where did he go after that football game? He hung out with Paul Engel, and of course, Tom Powell was there too. So the connections just go on, and all the pride of Iowa is in all of it. But like I said, what I want the reader to know is we're from a great state. But go ahead, Teresa.
well, I was going to say my aunt and uncle that lived in town in Stone City they were nobody really, and Paul took them to all these football games. They were hanging out with all these people all the time, and they were just Stone City people. I mean, it was he really immersed himself. They had a Sunday morning council meeting where I guess they each had a glass of whiskey while they talked about what was going on in Stone City. And Paul and, the other guys in Stone City sat around a kitchen table and had their council meeting. So he really was part of the small town Iowa.
He really was. And, one of the things I love to read was about the Grant Wood days that Anamosa started. And of course, they started to go from Anamosa more into Stone City. But, there was that circle of friends of Grant Woods who was very protective of him and his legacy. And I just loved reading about that. But I'm so grateful to the city of Anamosa for keeping his legacy alive. I didn't know the story about the University of Iowa and how they tried to keep his name out of the art history books. I mean, that's how powerful Lester Longman was with those connections. But I love the fact that students started to say, where is this guy in the history book? And even out in Colorado and Los Angeles, when I say, do you know who painted American Gothic? A lot of people know who painted American Gothic. It's amazing. But they're like, oh yeah, that's easy. That's Grant Wood. I'm like, really?
Yeah.
You know that? But
All right.
yeah.
We got two now, him and Caitlin Clark.
There you go. There you go. Absolutely. A lot to be proud of.
I was going to throw a comment in with the connections. You mentioned Eisenhower and his interest in broadcasting. His aide at the end of the war was a man named Cecil Butcher. And when they came back to Washington, obviously Eisenhower went into politics. Cecil became head of the CBS broadcasting network. And Cecil Butcher was a local Lynn County boy, grew up in Springville, Whittier area, family and longtime connections in Grant Wood country. He ended up going to high school up in the Clear Lake area, but he kept those connections with the family in that area. So yeah, a lot of talent came out of that Lynn County, Jones County area.
It really did. The one thing I want to mention before I forget, and this is a thanks to Paul Jewell, but you saw the sonnets that I used from Paul's book that said wise in water and said a secret and loved language, as well as scraps for his own inventing. Paul, the reason I connected those back to Park was because you wrote your book around Grant Wood being at Clear Lake and pictures of him in the water and with Park. That's where I connected those dots, was from your Clear Lake summer book. But then I also picked out the loved and secret language, which is around writing and about the fact that we believe Park wrote the thesis, but of course it was narrated by Grant Wood. And of course, scraps from his own inventing was because Park became somebody. People were just really impressed with Park, even though he had a creative writing degree. He used that to work for Iowa governors, Iowa congressmen like Smith and Culver. He went and made a great name for himself being an aide in Washington, D.C. And so that's why I used the scraps for his own inventing. But it was your book that influenced me to choose that wise in water piece.
Thank you. I was going to say a couple of factoids too, Dorothy, that just, I think, show that close connection between Park and Grant. One was that Park had promised Grant that he would name his firstborn son after him. And he did. His name was Grant Wood Reinert. The other fact is that at the very end of Grant's life, Nan was so overcome she couldn't go in and be with Grant in his final minutes, and Park was there with him. So a couple of interesting things about the friendship between the two men. Unfortunately, Grant Wood Reinert died at a young age. I'm not sure what took his life, but there are two children of Grant that still live in the Washington, D.C. area.
I love the story of Park Reinert, and that's why I used him in the book. And that's why it's taken me a while, because I've got to get all these permissions to use, because I want to use the name Dr. Seuss. It won't be that great of a book if I can't use some of those names. And I have like some of the writers in there, like Philip Roth, things like that in my book. But I really want to stay with those names just because it's about the education, the people of Iowa to know those truths and those connections. Wow.
So if I could just, I really love the talk. It was wonderful. One thing I learned, speaking of the meadow, where it all started and where it ends and where it remains, is when I was looking at all the plants and looking how Grant always depicted corn, he always depicts it, you know, the harvesting and planting of corn as it was in the meadow and never beyond that point. Like he never pictured a corn picker or a sheller or a tractor or anything but horse powered. I mean, agriculture was always pictured in the meadow through his whole life. It really resonates. I think it's great.
And you know, that autobiography, I hope you all don't mind me sharing this, but to your point, Thomas, is they always talk about how stern his father was, but this is why we want to talk about Grant Wood through local eyes. when you think about the farmers in Jones, Lynn County during those times, those were hard times. People were just trying to survive, and there was very much a survival instinct. And that soil was hard, and that eastern Iowa, for them to break that soil was incredibly tough. And that soil wasn't broken when his dad was farming. And sometimes I think the father gets a lot of disservice by being seen as stern and mean. But yet there's a point in that autobiography that Grant needs paint and his father can't afford it, but his father does find a way to buy Grant paint. And so I feel like some of those things get missed in the autobiography. People just concentrate on the stern father. Well, there was a lot of stern fathers in Lynn and Jones County. Even to this day, that was just part of farming and trying to keep your family surviving. But when I came across the meadow and he talked about that moment, and I think we can all feel that as children, is that especially if you have a lot of siblings, when you have that moment alone with your parents and you feel safe and your parents are in a good mood and life is happy and you're eating cookies and just the whole atmosphere is just safe and wonderful. I really wanted to capture, that's why his circle of friends did not want Patrice to expose that, because they felt like the critics had already just been so harsh on him. Let's give him something that he cherishes it, and don't touch it. Don't touch that meadow. And that's what Park was trying to say to Patrice. His legacy alone will surface. He will be great. But for now, let's just preserve something important to him and not give it out to the critics and all the rest, if that makes sense. But yeah, I just love that piece. I think it's missed, and I wanted to bring that out.
Well, I'm so glad you talk about the meadow, because it's a real thing. And the talk and you noticed, Tom, that, and we've talked about this in the forum before, that, you know, even as long ago as Grant Wood painted, he was nostalgic for previous farming practices before him. Well, and I can say that doesn't surprise me at all, because, and the fact that he focuses on the rolling hills and the landscapes, because I know that I'm not the only one who got lost in the hills, and the machinery was not much about it. You know, it really wasn't. I mean, literally spending time in the hills, on the land, wandering around in the creeks, you know, sledding down the hills, you know, barely, you know, maybe there's a tractor over there or whatever, but you're literally connected to this place. And I remember having a conversation with somebody at a wine bar in Des Moines recently. He was up from New Mexico, and he was here as a subcontractor to work on the carbon sequestration pipeline project. I struck up a conversation with him, and I talked to him about, he was telling me about how much pushback he was getting, you know, from farmers and things. And I said, well, it doesn't surprise me at all. I mean, they're connected to this land. He literally, he goes, it's just land. And I mean, literally he said that, it's just land. And I'm like, oh, you stepped in it now, didn't you?
I love that.
But no, but I was like the happy, oh, let me explain to you how land is life, and, you know, all the things that we know when you're so connected to place. And we talked about that too. And, you know, well, I don't know what's happened, but we're not seeing that pipeline laid yet, but it may come down the pike. But I'm certainly not saying anything about my impact on that. I was just wanting to educate him about the spirit, the underlying spirit of the feeling, and
Well said, Elaine.
Yes.
but the meadow, the point with meadow. I mean, I would say the meadow is so important that, well, anyway, that might be too. I'm going to stop, because what I was about to say is probably TMI. So,
but you know, Elaine, one of the things I've learned by living in different places is when you grow up in Iowa, you think soil is rich and black and fluffy, and everywhere you go, and it's not true. That soil in Iowa is rare, 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 rare. And I'm just adding to what you shared.
Yeah.
And that's why I ended the piece of the autobiography too, as I was reading out loud at the point about the soil. That was the gold. When people came west, that soil was gold. You go other places, Colorado, and you all know this, Florida, wherever, California, it's clay and it's sandy and it doesn't grow things as well as Iowa and in the surrounding states there. So yeah, they knew that. But at the time that Grant Wood's father was trying to make a place, to your good point, on that farm, that soil was not, what's the word, broken? Yeah, that was a hard life. I would be stern too.
Well, it sure makes me think. My grandmother always used to say, "There they go again, putting concrete on the best soil on the planet." And then, of course, let's not forget the great Joni Mitchell. They paved paradise and put up a parking lot.
But, you know, Dorothy, one of the things you didn't really mention, but that even Grant didn't think of painting of Iowa until, was it Marvin Cohen that suggested, he said, paint what you see around you.
Jay Sigmund.
And
Oh, is that
It was
Jay
Jay
Sigmund?
Sigmund.
because he
Yeah.
was, you know, he was painting and he wasn't, you know, he's changed his style too. He was more impressionist when he was in Europe, and even some of his Kenwood pictures and things. But he didn't even think right away, because being an Iowan, we do have a tendency to not appreciate what's right in front of us. It's easier to think, oh, we have to paint pictures of Paris or New York or something. And that's still part of the Iowa, you know, when I grew up, and I think even now, we can tend to not think of it as having as many, especially really talented people here.
Very talented people. I have to
Yeah.
tell you that I'm so glad you brought that up, because when Grant and Marvin Cohen went overseas to learn from the great masters, of course, they brought home, just to your good point, that artwork, or that thought that, yeah, I've got to be like a great master and do something that looks very European. And I love that when Grant was visiting Jay Sigmund, that Jay Sigmund was the person who said you should really paint what's in your own backyard. Now, here's why I love the regionalists, and this is why I talked about the Metropolitan Art Museum. The regionalists, I don't think people realize, they broke a glass ceiling. They broke a glass ceiling that America believed that great art only came from Europe. And that's why I chose that my heroine worked for European magazine. It's kind of that attitude. Only Europe has great art. But they broke the glass ceiling that great art can be painted in American, by Americans, about America. And I don't think people realize that about, you know, Thomas Hart Benton and John Stuart Curry and Grant Wood and Edward Hopper. But that's why the Metropolitan put them all together, because, yeah, they were regionalists, but they broke a glass ceiling in how American attitudes felt about art. And it's huge. And that they were in our own backyard. That just is mind-blowing to me.
But that's like Lester Longman, you were about University of Iowa. I mean, he was big into Picasso and the newest trend, but again, European, not American. And it, you know, that you're just not appreciated as much in your own hometown, as they say, as when you're
Yes.
from out. And Grant didn't get it here. He had to get it other places. Thank goodness he did.
And you know what I love about that story too, is that when he did what was in his own backyard, his greatness took off. And what I love about Grant Wood is, I think it's one wish I think every person, a human being, has, is to be remembered and to be, what's my word, immortal. That painting, American Gothic, is considered one of the top 3 most iconic paintings. It used to be the Mona Lisa and Scream, and of course, American Gothic. I'm trying to think, something's brought the Mona Lisa or Scream down. But yeah, it's, I mean, his painting is priceless. They can't even put a price tag on it. To be remembered like that, and it's so sad to me that he might have passed away thinking he was a nobody. That's why I kind of jumped on the University of Iowa in my book about both of these men. And that's what I didn't share, what they paralleled with is that they weren't honored and they're immortal. And that to me is the highest honor you can ever have in life. And that's just my perspective, is to be remembered.
Well, and if you just think about all of the wonderful people that he surrounded himself with that were drawn to him, people that say
Yes.
he wasn't smart or he wasn't, only at high school, he had amazing intelligence. Those great authors and other people that sought him out and stayed around him, they wouldn't have done that if he hadn't had a great intellect. And I think
Absolutely.
that speaks so much for him. And people don't know as much about that part of his life. Thank goodness there are people like Paul who writes things about the stories, and that brings out all of these interactions he had with these wonderful other people, other artists. Yeah.
Yeah, before the Stone City Art Colony, that was kind of a model that Grant Wood was already doing in Cedar Rapids. He would find these properties. He would take like the old Turner mortuaries and make them into these apartments. He'd get people to live there and either have like store fronts and shops, but also they would be apartments where people live, but they were all working together and kind of feeding off each other. Like, hey, you do art upstairs, I'll show it in my store down here. So he was creating these colonies. He had this in his mind, but he was creating colonies before the one we know today in Stone City. So it's the benevolent heart is my point. And Paul Engel, as you heard from Teresa, had a benevolent heart as well. So they were incredible masters, but they always brought everybody along on the journey with them. That says so much about them. I can go on and on all night, I know.
I wanted to compliment you for your program and let you know, I don't know if I broke a rule or something, but I'm from New York. And I came here and had to learn.
You're our adopted daughter.
My father was a soil conservationist born in the Bronx, and I grew up appreciating soil. And when I got out here, I appreciated it. But what I wanted to say originally, when I raised my hand, is that I broke a rule because when I was working at 5 Turner Alley, Grant Wood's studio, we had American Gothic there. And I was able to meet all these people who have written and are historians. And I met Joni Kinsey. I listened to her. She mentioned Return from Bohemia. And at that time, I wanted to write for children. And I thought, well, what's better than a book by Grant Wood that ends when he's 10 years old? I can find out about his childhood. And I got permission from her to Xerox the copy that was at the university library. And that's what I based my book, my second book, Creation of an Artist, on, is his childhood from his own words and memories of Nan in her books. And I learned a great deal about him. I narrowed it down to just that year when he's making that transition. And the reason people don't know much about the book, which I have shared with grade schools sitting in their classroom, and the kids love it. And so in a certain way, I am doing what you said. I discovered it and I'm bringing it to the future. And it was hard work to find it. But the reason people don't know about it is because it came out about 2 days before COVID hit and everything got closed down. So I wasn't able to share it with I did most of my sharing over Zoom. And at that time, it wasn't that popular yet. And the other book I wrote is about J. Sigmund, and I learned about him. Once again, I'm from New York. I was working at the History Center. My office was in the archives, and I came across this box about J. Sigmund, which I was using to teach kids about how we use archives. And I thought, well, if he's got a box, he must be famous for something. And I became compulsive because I had no idea who he was. And I met his daughter-in-law, who invited me up for tea in her apartment in Cottage Grove Place, Virginia Sigmund Myers. And she said, you can just make yourself at home and I'll have the tea ready for you in a moment. And I saw that painting that you all have heard me talk about, which is the quilts. And I heard the story from her. I liked the painting. I didn't know it was from Grant Wood until she pointed out, I said, I like this painting. And she said, look at the signature. Do you see who painted it? That was painted because my father-in-law, J. Sigmund, was walking along with Grant Wood, who was worried about being a painter like the ones from Paris, and said, you shouldn't be a copycat. You should paint Iowa. Look at those quilts. Look at those quilts on the line there. It's beautiful. It's Iowa. And this is like right along the Wapsipinicon River. And he gave that painting to them, and I saw it there. And you can see that painting as part of one of his last paintings, Spring in Town. It's hanging on the quilt. The quilt is hanging there on the line. So what you said is incredibly important, and hopefully it helped a New Yorker learn about appreciating Iowa. So thank you. And I think your book sounds fabulous.
And Barbara, I think you've got something coming up at the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art where we could meet you in person and talk to you. Can you tell us when that is?
Well, that is for Grant Wood's birthday. You're right. And I'd have to look at my calendar to let you know exactly what the date is, but it's their Art Bites. You want me to, I'll send it out to all of you. So I have to look on my calendar to tell you the exact time and date, but I'm going to do a program called The Memorial Window and More. So I will be discussing the other two books a little bit as well.
Hey,
what are you
Barbara?
doing? There it is. And there's the
Okay.
quilt. Thank you.
Yeah, so I didn't mean to interrupt, Barbara.
No,
but
that's good.
one of the things I wanted to tell you, all of you Grant Wood enthusiasts, see, to Barbara's good point, this is Grant Wood Spring in Town. See the quilt that's pink in color. I have a print of this in my house, and I always was looking for a quilt that looked like that, only to find out I have a college roommate who makes quilts, and she said, oh, that's a pattern from even before the 1930s. It's going to be tough to find. So I said to her, could you make me that quilt? And she did. But here's what we did. This painting sits in a museum in Terre Haute, Indiana. We called the museum and we got the exact color codes from the painting. So the quilt that I have in my house is the exact colors that Grant painted. So if you ever want to take something out of a Grant Wood painting, like a quilt, and have someone make it, know that a museum can give you the exact colors so you can replicate it.
Thank you, Dorothy. Wow.
Um,
I knew about your quilt. I remember you mentioning it. I want to make mention also, I mean, this Paul Jewell has done a wonderful program, and this was painted in Iowa City, but this is absolutely J. Sigmund's house right here. And when you see the real house in Wabeek, it looks like that. And it had a church right across the street. And this is the street that he was walking down where the quilts were hanging. And that house looks so much like it that J. Sigmund's grandson saw it and said, that's Papa's house. And he was just a little boy. Yeah.
And what I love about J. Sigmund, so he was the MC at the Stone City Art Colony. He was also a neighbor in Cedar Rapids to Paul Engel.
Right.
And of course, a great friend of Grant Wood. So that's what I love about all the connections, just all the connections.
Yeah, the connections are amazing.
And remind me, Dorothy and Barbara. Oh, sorry, Joe. just real quick, didn't we mention, and somebody mentioned in a previous forum, and probably it was you, Barbara, was the church in Springtown, what do we thinking that was modeled after the Viola Church?
No, it was supposed to, well, it might be, but there was definitely a church across the street. That's what his
Oh,
daughter-in-law
and there
told me.
wasn't one in
Yeah.
Moabeek?
Yeah, and
Okay.
his wife used to play the organ there.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay.
I don't think the
thank you.
church in Wabeek had the steeple, though. I think the steeple is patterned after the church in Viola.
That's very possible.
Yeah,
very
because it
possible.
really
Yeah.
looked like that. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, Joe, what do you got?
You guys are gonna think I'm crazy. You've never heard me defend Lester Longman in this forum. Over the years, I know at least 2 people in this group are working on projects that involve him, and I'm excited because I think in this day and age, as storytellers, we're interested to have conflicted protagonists and complicated antagonists. And it's easy to talk about Longman was terrible in this, but you know, it's interesting to think back. He was very good at what he did. He got the University of Iowa, that Beckman, the precursor to abstract expressionism. And when abstract expressionism came out and that group of guys in New York figured that out, Peggy Guggenheim had murals she didn't know what she had. Longman figured it out. He had it for a while and he didn't know what it was, but by the time he figured out where the movement was going, he held on to it. I only know about this because I wrote my master's thesis on it. I'm digging through the University of Iowa art archives, going through all these letters. I realized Longman and Guggenheim, their letters are there. They had, they had a little relationship going, even though he was married. And so she wanted it back. She said, Yale University gets that painting. And he was like, look, squirrel, he found a way to like distract her and the university. And if you go outside of the US, I mean, everything we love about Grant Wood, and when we talk about how iconic his paintings are, that is true. But people outside, big museums outside of the US, they don't really appreciate it. They don't appreciate regionalism. If you go to the Art Institute, if you go to Davenport, the Figge, if you go to the gift shops and look at all the little sets of books, Impressionism, abstract expressionism, pointillism, all the isms of art, you never see regionalism. It's not this thing we appreciate it to be. And so there are these weird things when we talk about art and who doesn't get it, who didn't get it back then. Today, I mean, we're so happy when we see somebody do a regionalism thing in New York or at the Whitney, and it's great, but those are really few and far between. Some great woods are owned by some of the great museums, but the East Coast intelligentsia, they still kind of look down their noses on it. And that's why regionalism is not included in those uniform collections. It's not taught the same way in art schools that like we like to think it is. I mean, there's still quite a battle going on. And some of the flags that Longman planted in the ground and died on those hills, those flags are recognized, and those movements are coveted by art scholars and critics around the world, not just in the US. And so when we think about how problematic Longman was, and he really was evil to some degree, he was terrible. The whole time capsule thing that's still waiting to be unearthed, and about that whole thing. I find it interesting now that we're telling more stories about these characters we know and some of them we love. I always find it interesting to think, well, now we know a lot more about Longman too, and some of these narratives, they deserve a bit of the complicated, angles about Longman, because he did do a lot for the art world. So, okay, now I'm done. I'm not going to defend Longman anymore.
But I just,
I love it.
to piggyback on that, it didn't just start and end with abstract expressionism. I mean, printmaking at the U of I is world renowned with Lazansky, as is conceptual art, like happenings, and the term mixed media, I think, came from the University of Iowa art program, and artists like Hans Brader and Anna Mendieta, who's like one of my all-time favorites, like world renowned. We don't talk about that very much, but
The U of I Art Museum has some of the best Rothkos out there. And even though Longman is known for being the hoity-toity critic guy, he also had this summer series where he made art for everybody. And he opened up the doors, and people came from all over the Midwest to learn about art. And so I think those stories get pushed down because it's easier just to say bad guy. But a lot of that stuff is out there for the digging. And so I'm always curious to see how some of that stuff gets expressed in some of these narratives. So my question for you, Dorothy, is, first of all, I love the presentation. Can't wait to read this book as well, and it's going to be interesting. But I know you have decisions as a writer, and you're on the fringes in some of these controversies. You're kind of knee deep in others, and you have a narrative direction that you're interested in going, and you don't want to get complicated in this other thing just because other people like to get into the complications. And to this day, there's scholarly consensus about, Grant Wood's sexual identity, and depending on who you talk to then and now, there's some people who would rather say, oh, there's no proof that means he wasn't, and I don't want to talk about it. And other people are like, well, that's the great complication that we get to learn and explore and think things through. And that decision was in front of you, I'm sure, and you get to think about, ooh, do I go there? And if so, how do I? How did you approach that as a writer?
I didn't go there, to be absolutely honest with you. I think it goes with the theme of the legacy. Let the legacy surface the way it's meant to surface. And sometimes it has a better chance of truth if you let that happen. That makes sense?
Yeah.
Actually, where I got the concept of this, I don't know if you know the movie. It's an old movie. Who Shot Liberty Valance?
John Wayne.
John Wayne, yeah. And I got the idea of the legacy piece from sometimes you let things lie and let the legacy form itself, and the truth will also surface. And I use that as a North Star to my book. So it's kind of that theme of you can try to squash someone's greatness, but time will find a way to bring it forward and bring the truth out. And that was kind of my North Star. So I'll let the reader decide. Yeah, Shannon.
I had actually I had a question for Barbara. I was trying to interject, but I didn't get in there quickly enough. But I just wanted to ask you if you knew. So my mom, Catherine Roach, was really good friends with Virginia, and I had been in her place, and I had seen that Grant Wood hanging on her wall, and of course I was amazed because I was an art major that she just had a Grant Wood hanging in her place. And then when I don't know if you remember at the U.S. History Museum, the old one, she had a little exhibit where they had that there, and she talked about that whole story with her father-in-law,
Right.
talked about the quilts and all of that. And then I believe when she passed, it went to one of her granddaughters, but I'm wondering if it's back out in circulation. I heard
It's,
they had sold it. Do you know where it is or what happened to it?
I don't know where it is. It went to her niece. Well, she asked me obviously before she passed away, what she should do with it. And it was decided that she would give it to the Museum of Art as what is called a permanent loan. So that meant that the family still owned it, but it was being housed at the Museum of Art. And they used to have it up every once in a while, and I would tell something about it when I was there. But after a while, I didn't see it anymore. And I learned that the family took it back. And this niece lived in Vermont, and I don't think she appreciated some of this stuff Virginia had, which was amazing. We don't know where it was, but my husband, who's a collector, was going through one of these art catalogs, catalogs of things that it wasn't art necessarily, but he found a copy of that painting. It doesn't say that it's by Grant Wood. It doesn't say the name of it. It doesn't have his signature on it, but he was able to buy me a copy of it, and it's in a frame, and I think he bought it for $35, and it's hanging in my house. It's like not exactly a poster, but it's I know what it is, but there is no indication on there that this is supposedly Grant Wood's first painting of where he's trying to not be an impressionist. And he's trying to paint Iowa. And so my book about J. Sigmund has that whole story in it. And that's what I learned about J. Sigmund. He was connected to both Paul Engel and Grant Wood by helping them to realize how important Iowa was. He introduced Paul Engel to poetry. And I wanted to say, I believe, and I don't want to say anything bad about your book, Dorothy, but I believe it was J. Sigmund who was teaching about poetry at the Little Gallery, and Paul Engel was one of his students, not one of the teachers there, because he's of a younger generation. But
Yeah. No,
although
thank
it
you.
could be that it lasted long enough that Paul Engel was a teacher there too, but J. Sigmund was an important teacher there. Yeah,
That's those archives I told you I was trying to find, because I remember being surprised that I thought I had read Paul Engel. But yeah, that's one of those archive pieces I was telling you earlier tonight. I've got to find it.
Right. And I'm not sure, but I do know that he was a student there. I know that for sure.
Yeah.
So,
If there's one thing we know in this forum is that all things come back to J. Sigmund.
oh, absolutely.
Right, Barbara?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I was going to add about the painting that it did sell at auction. The family sold it, and it went for something like $45,000 or $50,000.
Oh my God.
But we don't know where it is right now.
Oh, it's easy to find online, actually.
Oh, really?
But
Oh yeah. If you search on the name of the painting, you will find the auction listing.
But you don't know who it is that owns it, right?
No, you don't know who owns it.
Right. So we don't know where it is.
But you know the date. You can find the auction house that had it. Its description. Yep, it's all there.
Thank you for that update.
And it's called The Quilts.
Yeah.
Or just Quilts.
Just quilts, yeah.
You can find it.
And I also had one more comment, because Dorothy mentioned that this partner of Lester's, going back to Joe, because I am one of those who is writing a piece that involves Lester's doing and keeping him out of the history books. So the partner's name was Horst Jansen, and his family wrote the textbook, The History of Art. This was a textbook. This wasn't just American art, history of art. So for decades, his family and descendants controlled the editorial content in this book. So I did research on this. However, I don't have it on the top of my head what year that changed, but literally the content in those books did not change till like the 1980s when he was included. Regionalism was intentionally left out. So I would argue, Joe, that the reason regionalism may have been overlooked is because it was intentionally omitted from one of the most eminent books on the history of art.
Shannon, that's what I remember too. And it wasn't until the 80s that art students too started to say, where is this Grant Wood guy? Yeah, that's what I remember.
He was obviously not a fan of regionalism, and he was all about modernism. And, I love modernism and those movements. And the truth is, I believe that if Grant Wood had lived past 1942, he would have had a crisis in his artwork, because modernism, starting with abstract expressionism and all these movements, were really against anything that looked like regionalism. So he would have, I think, struggled to maintain his style with all those new styles coming up personally. But I just wanted to bring that up.
No, thank you. No, thank you. One last thing I want to share, and I have my brother Daryl and Kathy, his wife, my great sister-in-law, on this call, but I wanted to share a quick story about what we got to do recently too. I took you back to this map of the University of Iowa from 1942, but the art building there by the river got destroyed in the flood. What was that, 2008, 2009, which is the Cedar Rapids area? What was it?
2008.
2008, thank you. And so, of course, they shut it down. Well, Daryl, you want to tell the rest of the story about how we got to go in that building? And this is my older brother, Daryl. But he gave me a great gift.
Me too.
We're going to get him off. Yeah, off mute.
Oops.
No, not able to do it? Well, my brother knows the gentleman in the group that was basically after the flood kind of had ownership to this building, but it was shut down to the public because there was so much damage from the flood. It's right by the river. And of course, it was the building where the Life magazine actually interviewed Grant Wood. That picture of him kind of flung over the chair, I believe, was taken in that building. And but thanks to my brother, this group, and I'm trying to remember, it was a group that was kind of taking care of the building. Daryl, you can shake your head yes or no, but knew them and we got a chance to tour the art building and see where Grant Wood held his classes. And it was an incredible building. In the basement, there was all this artwork on the wall, like murals. It looked very much, I think, some African-American type of murals and things like that. But the building was still in good shape. It's just condemned because of the flood. And I think they're resurrecting it. I don't know if anybody knows that, but we got this rare chance to go in there and see where Grant had his classroom. And that was really, really cool. So thank you, Daryl and Kathy, for that. Said, come home, come see this. That was great.
I found the auction record, by the way.
Woohoo!
It's quick. It was sold by Sotheby's. The estimate was $50,000 to $70,000. It says on it, by the way, the official name of the painting is Patchwork Quilt, because it was titled that on the reverse of the painting. And the provenance is J.G. Sigmund, acquired as a gift directly from the artist by descent from the above, the great grandfather of the present owners at that time. So anyway, you can find this, easily.
Thank you. I didn't know
Yes,
that.
thank you.
Yeah, that's awesome, Steve.
Thank you so much. So the other thing I heard, I don't remember who I heard this from, about that art building is that at some point since the flood, it was suggested that it be named after Grant Wood. And there was pushback from the university on that, and it never happened or was disregarded. Has anyone heard about that?
Oh, great question.
I do know that it's not going to harbor any art students. I think it's building for graduate studies of some type. Was in the local newspaper.
Yeah, maybe Maura Pilcher would know more about that.
Yeah, yeah.
Perhaps.
There was
Maybe.
just an article out about how many $1 million have been raised or to renovate it, and I was trying to find it to post it, but I can't find it. But I do know that it's in the works, the reno on that building.
And there's also a question about the cornerstone containing some
Right.
paper concerning the university's relationship with Grant Wood that will tell us more if they ever remove that and if the materials are in good condition.
I was going to ask about that. I heard it was like a regular time capsule or something.
Yes.
And I wondered if it had been destroyed. So it's not destroyed from the flood. You don't think?
I don't
Not-
think they've found it yet or have
Yeah.
looked. It's like
Yeah.
this, oh, it's still there. No one's really making a big push to find it, as
Wow.
far as I know.
Well, our group should do that. There,
Yeah.
there's a thing we can work on. Wow.
And if they find it and if what we think is in there, we'll see. It's not a good ending to the story because
No.
it's the gossip that Longman had and wanted to hold against Grant Wood, and at a day and age when sexual identity and wasn't understood even by the field of psychology, for crying out loud. And it was just this terrible thing to blame somebody of and hold over somebody's head and to start a paper trail, and then, well, this will get him fired. And then as things became what they became after the big explosions, and then people left. It's like, what do we do with this? Well, it's in this time capsule, and one day the truth will come out. And it's like, that's kind of cringy. But as far as the history of the way that story went, apparently that time capsule is in one of those cornerstones, and at some point someday we'll open up the news and see that, oh, they finally opened it and here's what it said. That will be interesting one day, right?
Yeah, I sure.
I didn't even know that. Actually what happened was it was never determined that it was actually Lester Longman, but a leak was made to the Time magazine in New York, and they sent a reporter from Chicago, a woman, Eleanor, oh my gosh, Eleanor, let me see her last name. I'm just drawing a blank on her name. Eleanor Welch. And she came down and interviewed everyone for about a week in the winter. I think it was December 41. And so it had been leaked, and there was a list of things, and there's actually a letter, and that letter exists that was written to Time, and that these were the points that had been suggested. And they were, I should know all this off the top of my head, but there were a bunch of them. But it was never actually determined that Lester was the one that wrote to Time and alerted them to these things to trigger this whole investigation. In the end, she didn't end up writing an article about it or exposing him. But again, that whole part's fuzzy too. Why she didn't, why she dropped it, it remains to be, don't know. We don't know that.
All right, see, I knew this would happen, Dorothy. Look what you did.
No, it's fun. I just love everybody's input and perspectives and questions and knowledge. And that's just what I love about these sessions.
Well, we have had a great time tonight, and I think this is just a warm up for being able to roll into our final session next week, and we'll just let it run its course as well as this one did. That's awesome. I hope everybody stays safe and warm wherever you are. We're supposed to kind of get a little icy something going on here in our neck of the woods. But and reach out if you're trying to get a hold of each other. Do it directly, or I'd be happy to connect you or introduce you to each other if you need to, through emails and stuff. So keep on keeping on. And
thank you, Elaine.
Yeah, is everybody?
Thank you, Dorothy.
Yeah.
Thanks, everybody.
Bravo. We'll see you all next week.
All right.